รายการต่อไปนี้เป็นรายการทั่วไปสามารถรับชมได้ทุกวัย
สนับสนุนโดยแลกเงินด้วยบัตรเครดิตกสิกรไทยเที่ยวก่อนจ่ายที่หลังไม่มีค่าธรรมเนียมผ่อนชำระได้จากธนาคารกสิกรไทย
สวัสดีค่ะมองเรามองโลกวันนี้เป็นบทสัมภาษณ์พิเศษศาสตราจารย์อาร์ตูโร บริสผู้อำนวยการสถาบัน IMD World Competitiveness Center หรือสถาบันจัดอันดับขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของประเทศต่างๆทั่วโลกตั้งอยู่ที่ประเทศสวิตเซอร์แลนด์ค่ะเรามาดูกันนะคะว่าประเทศไหนมีขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันที่สูงและมีปัจจัยอะไรบ้างที่ทำให้เกิดสภาวะแบบนั้นประเทศไทยเองอยู่อันดับที่เท่าไหร่และต้องทำอะไรบ้างเพื่อที่จะปรับปรุงให้ดีขึ้นค่ะสถาบัน IMD จัดอันดับขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของประเทศต่างๆทั่วโลกโดยวิเคราะห์ประสิทธิภาพของแต่ละประเทศในการสร้างและรักษาปัจจัยแวดล้อมที่ทำให้ธุรกิจต่างๆสามารถแข่งขันกับผู้อื่นได้สถาบัน IMD รวบรวมข้อมูลจากองค์กรสากลอย่างกองทุนการเงินระหว่างประเทศหรือ IMF และธนาคารโลกรวมถึงสถาบันเอกชนชั้นนำหลายแห่งเช่น PricewaterhouseCoopers Mercer HR Consulting และ CB Richard Ellis นอกจากนั้นยังมีการสำรวจข้อมูลจากการทำแบบสอบถามของผู้บริหารระดับกลางและระดับสูงกว่า 6,000 คนในหลายประเทศทั่วโลกสำหรับการจัดอันดับขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของปี 2015 นี้อันดับ 1 คือสหรัฐอเมริกาอันดับที่ 2 ฮ่องกงอันดับที่ 3 สิงคโปร์อันดับที่ 4 สวิตเซอร์แลนด์และอันดับที่ 5 แคนาดา Professor Arturo, what is competitiveness?
Competitiveness refers to the ability of a nation or a company to generate long-term value. Value means jobs, value means profits, value means welfare, but it's also long-term value. So competitiveness for us is long-term sustainability. Competitiveness is not the same as competition. So when two countries compete, one wins and the other loses. And when countries compete, they do it to gain market share or to extract profits from each other. Competitiveness leads to a win-win situation. So competitiveness, again, meaning building systems and processes to just generate value creation, is something that two nations can do together. For example, when they trade. When Thailand and China, or when Thailand and Malaysia, or when Thailand and India trade with each other, both countries are better off.
ขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันไม่ใช่การเอาชนะกันของประเทศต่างๆแต่เป็นสิ่งที่แต่ละประเทศร่วมมือกันได้และนำไปสู่ประโยชน์ของทุกฝ่าย
How does competitiveness impact a country?
Well, competitiveness it is the right objective of economic policy. So for us, when governments focus on building a competitive system, then they choose the right priorities. Because, first of all, they focus on people. Second, they focus on making people's life better. And third, because they invest the right resources in the right uses. So competitiveness at the end drives success of a nation. Success, again, measured by any metric that you can have of economic performance, from job creation to economic growth.
Competitiveness and sustainable development, how are they related?
Well, competitiveness is a precondition for sustainable development. But we need to understand sustainability not just as preserving, the triple bottom line, people, profit, and planet. Sustainability is something much simpler, which is to what extent countries can continue growing, continue generating value for a long period of time.
Is there a checklist of what are the components of being a competitive country in general?
So there is not a cooking recipe for Thailand, as there is not a cooking recipe for Spain, my country. But what we have is a very simple model. And the question is how each country is going to apply this model. A competitive system requires a good government. Okay? A good government is a government that provides the right regulation, that is transparent and corruption-free, that enjoys good finances, and that promotes business creation. Pillar number one. Pillar number two is that a government needs to invest in people. And this means that a competitive economy enjoys good health systems, good education, good infrastructure, that is good roads, airports, access to water, and it's an economy where at the end of the day job creation becomes priority number one. That's pillar number two. And the pillar number three is the private sector. So a competitive economy needs to have a private sector that promotes job creation, productivity, transparency, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And this requires good executives, this requires good governance system, and this requires good attitudes and values.
ช่วงหน้าเราจะไปวิเคราะห์3อันดับแรกของประเทศที่มีขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันสูงที่สุดในโลกกันค่ะในการจัดอันดับขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของปี 2015 นี้สหรัฐอเมริกายังคงครองแชมป์อยู่ในอันดับที่ 1 ดังเช่นปีที่แล้วในขณะที่ฮ่องกงได้เลื่อนขึ้นมาเป็นอันดับที่ 2 แทนที่สวิตเซอร์แลนด์ซึ่งตกไปเป็นอันดับที่ 4 ในขณะที่สิงคโปร์ยังคงอยู่อันดับที่ 3 เช่นเดียวกับปีที่ผ่านมา
If we look at the rankings for 2015, the top three are still the US, Hong Kong, and Singapore. They're always among the top 5. How do they maintain their rankings to always be on the top?
This is a good example of what I meant earlier by not having a good cooking recipe for success, because these three countries are completely different. You may think that the success of an economy is driven by its size. So the US is a very large economy. Well, in contrast, Singapore and Hong Kong are not. You may think that the key to success is being exporting economies like Hong Kong or Singapore. Well, actually, the US is an importing economy. You may consider that this has to do with the natural resources. Well, the US is rich in resources, but Hong Kong and Singapore are not. So there is no clear model. So how do these countries preserve their top position? The United States is, at the end of the day and for many years, is the most innovative economy in the world. It's the country with the best universities, the country with an amazing infrastructure, including technological infrastructure. It's a country that invests massively in health and education, and it's a country with an extremely powerful corporate sector. So it has been on the top for the last 10 years. Now you have economies like Hong Kong or Singapore, which have built their competitive model on something completely different. These are small countries with no natural resources that have attracted a lot of talent and that have created the perfect conditions for business creation. So these are countries that are based on governments with a particular vision, consist of generating businesses. And they have been extremely successful. But those two particular countries are, to me, exceptions that are extremely difficult to extend to any other continent or economy.
Is there a general trend for 2015 survey or findings?
We find two common issues. First, that growth is coming back to the normal countries. Meaning, 10 years ago, we used to talk about Brazil, China, Russia, emerging economies as the future of the world economy and economic growth.
Right.
In 2015, we find that there is a big disappointment about those economies. So now growth is returning to traditional economies like the United States or Germany. The second issue that we find is common in our ranking is what we call the challenge of productivity. I mean, we are confronted with an economic reality now where technological innovation is driving productivity up. That is, now economic systems are more productive, including Thailand. However, the challenge for most countries now is how to make sure that when you become more productive, you do so by preserving job creation. What happens with technological innovation is that there is less and less need for jobs and for labor. Because, you know, economies are more technologically advanced.
You use
machines that replace humans. We may end up in a situation in which technological innovation makes people useless. And then, for us, this is a bad sign of competitiveness. Remember that competitiveness, value creation, requires job creation.
สำหรับผลการจัดอันดับขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันในเอเชียแม้ว่าฮ่องกงจะสามารถไต่อันดับขึ้นมาอยู่ในอันดับ 2 ของโลกสิงคโปร์ยังคงตำแหน่งอันดับที่ 3 ของโลกและไต้หวันขึ้นมาอยู่อันดับที่ 11 ของโลกแต่หลายประเทศในเอเชียมีอันดับที่ลดลงอย่างเช่นมาเลเซียตกลงจากอันดับที่ 12 มาอยู่อันดับที่ 14 ญี่ปุ่นตกจากอันดับที่ 21 มาอยู่อันดับที่ 27 อินโดนีเซียตกจากอันดับที่ 37 มาอยู่อันดับที่ 42 ส่วนไทยตกจากอันดับที่ 29 มาอยู่อันดับที่ 30
For Asian countries, for the 2015 rankings, are there any striking findings?
Yes and no. That is, to me, the striking fact about Asia is that we cannot talk about Asia anymore as a region. You know, I remember 10 years ago how the typical mantra among corporates in the West was to say, we need to go to Asia. We need to go to Asia. If you look at Asia, there are big differences between Singapore and the Philippines. In particular, in the context of competitiveness, we find these 4 blocks. On the top, you have Singapore and Hong Kong as the exceptions. Second, then you have the successful economic models of Taiwan and Malaysia, which are in between 10 and 20 in world competitiveness. Then you have a bulk of countries that are trying to improve their competitiveness, like Thailand, but also South Korea or Indonesia. And then finally, you have the disappointing countries, the countries that are struggling, which includes certainly the Philippines and India. So there are these 4 blocks. And that's why I say that you cannot generalize. I think we need to consider each country in isolation.
For Thailand's ranking, we fell 1 place from 29 to 30 this year. And from the year before, from 27 to 29. So it's now like a downward trend. Should I worry about this, or is this just a couple of places, no big deal?
No, I mean, the ranking is not relevant. I think it's important to analyze where the trends come from. And I think in Thailand we find, you know, the strength and the weaknesses. The strength is the economic performance. So the country has been growing well and is performing well economically. The economy is becoming stronger and stronger. Exports still drive economic performance. The services sector is doing well. But, and that's what we observe in our rankings, the weakness of the Thai economy lies in its business sector. That is, if you look at what we call the ranking of business efficiency, it is relatively the weakest among all pillars of competitiveness. And the reason is productivity and business regulation. The business sector is still not productive enough, and I think the economy needs to focus on the right sectors. And second, we still lack the right business regulation. Competition laws, stock market access, corporate governance, all these pieces of regulation that spur business creation and innovation. Private and the public sector need to work together and build bridges. So, first of all, the government provides the right regulation, but second, the private sector, you know, indicates the government what the private sector needs. The private sector may need access to financing, or may need better competition laws, or may need better institutional development. And I think those partnerships need to be built.
ช่วงหน้าวิเคราะห์ขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของไทยกันต่อรวมถึงหาหนทางออกจากกับดักรายได้ปานกลางของไทยกันค่ะ เมื่อปี 2554 ธนาคารโลกได้ยกระดับฐานะทางเศรษฐกิจของประเทศไทยจากระดับประเทศที่มีรายได้ปานกลางขั้นต่ำขึ้นมาเป็นประเทศที่มีรายได้ปานกลางขั้นสูงแต่หลังจากนั้นไทยกลับตกอยู่ในกับดักรายได้ปานกลางนั่นคือไม่สามารถพัฒนาตัวเองไปสู่ประเทศพัฒนาแล้วที่มีฐานะร่ำรวยได้
Thailand is said to be caught in a middle income trap. What does this reflect about Thailand's competitiveness?
It's a trap where a few countries are nowadays. I think that while Thailand is trapped, is in the right track. And we're going to see that in the next 10 years, the next 20 years, Thailand is definitely going to become a high-income country. Thailand is focusing on the agricultural sector, is focusing on low value-added industries, and is not focusing on services yet. While 70% of the jobs, between 60 and 70% of the jobs in Thailand come from the services sector, there's still a lot to be done in that sector. And also, in the agricultural sector, Thailand needs to focus on higher value-added agricultural industries rather than exporting non-elaborated goods. Once this happens, which I think is not a big hassle for the Thai economy, once this happens, Thailand will move into the high-income countries.
But for this modern times, what countries would serve as good examples of how they jump out of the middle income trap?
Well, good examples, but not representative examples. If you remember what the United Arab Emirates was 50 years ago, it was a low-income country. Switzerland, 50, 60 years ago, was a purely agricultural country. So those two countries have just come out of the trap quite easily, through innovation and through people's brains and through the right regulation. But they are not extensible examples. Most of the European countries after the Second World War became high-income countries by focusing on education and human capital. Other countries like Australia or Latin American economies focus their models on natural resources. So very different models. China obviously has a competitive advantage, which is size. Large country, too many people, access to absolutely everything, a huge domestic market. So, there are very different economic models and they all work.
How does being a competitive country help improve income inequality in that country? Can it help?
Well, that's a tricky question because, if you look at the raw data, that if you look at statistically what happens is that especially in the low levels, as economies become more competitive, the price to pay is income inequality. And that's a problem, because then the dilemma that you have is whether you can be a country that is fair and completely equal, but not competitive, like for example Venezuela, or you're going to be a competitive economy that pays the price of income inequality. As countries then move from middle income to high income, then it is very easy to provide social systems and tax policies and fiscal policies, so income inequality is reduced.
We cannot reconcile the two.
In the early stages, if you move from being a very poor country to a middle income country, then the levels of inequality are going to increase. And the reason is that innovation and entrepreneurship require rewards. And then what you see is that the gap between the rich and the poor is going to increase. Thailand is already there. Okay, so now the question for Thailand is, one who have reached a certain level of development now, how we make sure that we preserve a certain level of fairness.
So would some social welfare or some social nets from the government help with this?
Certainly. I mean, you look at the models of the Nordic countries in Europe, or the European countries in general, these are countries that have built amazing systems of governmental policy that provide a social net that makes them some of the least unequal countries in the world. Countries like Denmark, Norway, or even Germany, where public policy makes sure that it's not that we punish those at the top, is that we preserve the living standards of those at the bottom. And that should be the role of social policy.
For individuals, how can we help improve the competitiveness of our own country?
That's a very good question. Because at the end of the day, the countries that have failed in the recent years to provide competitiveness are those countries where there is a massive lack of individual responsibility. I'm thinking about where I come from. Europe and Southern European countries like Greece or Spain. You need a certain degree of individual responsibility and commitment to make sure that your country becomes more competitive. This requires simple things as, for example, paying your taxes, respecting the law, contributing to social institutions and inclusive institutions, like trade unions or political parties, or any means of representing people's voices. So personal responsibility that is socially committed. That is when we really want to build a better society, and that is the result of a good education. That is, this needs to be this is not something that is in our DNA. It needs to be incorporated into our education system.
สิ่งที่ศาสตราจารย์อาร์ทูโร บริสพูดได้อย่างน่าสนใจนะคะก็คือว่าไม่มีสูตรตายตัวในการที่แต่ละประเทศนั้นจะสร้างขีดความสามารถให้กับตัวเองจะต้องกลับไปดูแล้วค่ะว่าตัวเองนั้นมีจุดเด่นอะไรศักยภาพอยู่ตรงไหนแล้วก็ดึงออกมาใช้ให้เกิดประโยชน์สูงสุดค่ะพบกันใหม่สัปดาห์หน้าวันนี้สวัสดีค่ะ